Hello, everyone. We've had the usual technical difficulties, little snags that we sometimes at least have at the beginning. Well, first of all, of course, I want to thank you all for joining me. This is the last in the series, last webinar in the series for this spring, and of course, we'll resume in the fall. This one is on a subject that I have to admit, I have to make a confession, even though I know it's not going to be to my benefit, that in the handful of years that I've been spending now doing this work, future studies for IFCU, this is a subject, climate change, that I haven't given a lot of attention to until now. While focusing on universities and colleges, this is an issue that I have not, of course, completely ignored, but compared to other issues that I've addressed, I can't say that I have researched or written extensively on this issue. And as I was preparing this presentation, I was wondering why this was the case. And I thought that maybe this reflects perhaps common expectation that it's the place of governments. It behooves governments and governance bodies rather than civil society actors to take the lead in fighting climate change. Or it's the French in me, I don't know, because the French do expect government to do virtually everything for them. So I don't know what it is, but I think in probably broad, vast parts of the world, the common perception is still that it's primarily government business to put in place policies that address climate change. Be that as it may, the fact is that it's a fairly today consensual thing to say that governments have not been doing enough. Whether they are or should be the primary actors regarding this issue or not, I think it's common knowledge, and there's again a consensual agreement that governments have not been doing enough. Climate change, when I was a child, was called pollution, then it was called global warming, then from global warming, we transitioned to the more perhaps innocuous sounding, but no less factually threatening climate change, expression of climate change. The fact is that it's been part of the global awareness for decades. Yet talking about government action from one Earth Summit to the next, every decade, with every yearly COP meeting, Conference of the Parties, which has been meeting every year since 1995, we see that concerted action on the part of multiple state actors and other stakeholders is very difficult. That very often a short-term vision prevails, or the global north, global south divide prevents meaningful global action, despite the fact that I think is clear to all of us, or most of us at least today, that this is the one subject that requires concerted action in which every single country on the planet has a stake and must be an actor. So the thought that civil society institutions such as universities have a significant role to play in climate action was perhaps not self-evident in the past few decades. But it's turning out, climate change is becoming a major issue in higher education across the world. And this for at least three reasons that are specific to the very nature of higher education institutions. One reason, I'll share screen here. This is my first slide. No, I want to go in slideshow mode. Okay. Three reasons for this. One, the fact that colleges and universities are, of course, hubs of research and teaching, and that as such, they must address the current global challenges, and climate change is certainly one of them, if not the first and foremost. The second reason is that, as often large organizations, universities themselves can take a leading role in reducing their own carbon emissions, and a leading role in adopting a whole range of other measures that can address climate change, again, as organizations. And the third reason is that colleges and universities today cater to a generation of students who are acutely aware of climate change challenges, or tend to be at least, who often advocate a strong activism in matters related to climate change, and who now increasingly actually demand that society address this challenge, for the very understandable reason that climate change jeopardizes their future lives more than those of the older generations, their future lives as adults and the lives of the generations that will come after them. So for these basic reasons, at least, colleges and universities are bound to become major players in climate action. And what I'm going to do today is to give you an overview of what some of them are already doing. That's going to be my part one. Then of what challenges and barriers can still prevent universities from taking, there's my outline right there, can still prevent universities from taking meaningful climate action. And finally, of what more, an overview of what more universities could do to address climate change, a subject that is now vastly debated in the higher education literature and media, with more and more a tone of activism, a tone of advocacy, etc. Okay, so these are my three parts for today. First of all, what's being done? The first thing that is necessary to point out, as I suggested a moment ago, is that there are multiple levers of climate action that can be available to universities as universities, of which I see at least four. The first one is, of course, to promote research and innovation on climate change, on climate technology, keeping in mind here that scientific expertise is essential to any discussion of climate change, and that scientific expertise is, of course, produced by universities, just as much as today's common sense knowledge, okay, what everybody, quote unquote, knows, such as melting ice caps or sea level change, or, you know, smog in cities, bleaching in oceans, et cetera, is the product of scientific research and academic work that has been accumulating over decades. So there's something like a natural vocation, of course, for universities from the standpoint of research and innovation to play a leading role in this matter. Second, the idea of educating, meaning of including educational contents that develop awareness to climate change, that promote sustainability across curricula through a transdisciplinary approach. Third, becoming leading actors in curbing their own carbon footprint and transitioning to renewable energy. And fourth, engaging in public outreach to disseminate educational contents, to promote environmental responsibility and sustainable practices at all levels, at community level, regional, national, international level. Now, among this broad range of possible actions that are available, at least on paper, to colleges and universities, I want to now take a look at examples of what some universities that are leading climate action are doing, bearing in mind that this is only a minute sample, that multiple actions, programs, initiatives, curricula are being implemented already at multiple levels by multiple institutions around the world to address climate change. So this is, of course, a very tiny sample of what some universities among the leaders are doing in this respect. Three examples. The first one is the University of Tasmania in Australia, which is ranked first in the world for climate action. I'll go back to the question of ranking in a minute. Ranked first in the world for climate action, and has done the following things: committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2030, divested from fossil fuels, and established a climate justice network to support interdisciplinary research and teaching on climate change. Next, the University of Manchester, which has pledged to become carbon neutral by 2038, has also invested 400 million pounds in low carbon infrastructure, and has also launched, with significant success, I might add, a MOOC on climate change solutions. This is for the dissemination part. And the third example is the Zhangjiaotong Liverpool University, which is a joint venture university based in Suzhou, Jiangsu in China, founded in 2006. It's a partnership between the University of Liverpool and Zhangjiaotong University in China. And you can see what it's done already. Reduced its paper consumption by 70% by transitioning to online marking or online grading. I think we're all at one level or another experiencing that. It's developed a range of courses on sustainability and green technology, and it's established a Green Campus office to promote environmental awareness and action. Now, this is at institutional level. At global level, there's lots and lots of things to mention. Of course, I will limit myself to only a couple. One is the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, which aims to engage universities around the world to decarbonize their campuses. Okay, so this is very specific. It is a framework that encourages the ability to bring universities to share best practices, to share resources, to share tools. This is important because a lot of stakeholders decry the fact that this is what is most lacking, that a lot of institutions are taking at individual level interesting initiatives, but that the major lack is in coordination, is in the exchange of best practices between institutions, between colleges and universities around the world. So this is one of the major goals of this UN initiative, knowing that, again, the focus is on decarbonizing campuses, okay? It's part of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the SDSN. In the framework of this, they have published a net zero on campus guide, which you can see here, guide and toolkit. Okay, so this is the broad presentations page, and then the guide is right here. The toolkit includes case studies and resources. Okay, this is work that has been done by the UN in collaboration with the Monash University's Climate Work Center and Energy Institute in Australia. The resources in the toolkit detail campus initiatives that can be taken to reduce emissions across energy, transport and mobility, buildings and facilities, waste management, value chains, through a broad range of specific actions. What is the impact of this? So far, we know that the UN Race to Zero campaign has been joined by about 1,000 universities around the world. The other thing I will mention here is the Times Higher Education University rankings for climate action. Let me move this here. This is the only ranking of its kind. In other words, the only ranking that takes into account climate action impact at institutional level, okay, as a criteria to include in the ranking. It was launched by Times Higher Education in 2019, and it rates over today 1,500 universities every year against the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And here I can tell you, because I've been able to observe this in my work, that when it was first launched, this ranking was widely perceived by many stakeholders as, you know, just another ranking, albeit innovative, but that perhaps wouldn't have that much of an impact, or at least not as much as the traditional rankings that we know, Shanghai, US News and World Report, etc. But that perception of this ranking in the last few years has significantly changed over the past 4 years, since it was created 4 years ago, and that a growing number of universities are taking notice. And my hunch is that in the coming years, more and more institutions are going to want to compete in these rankings as much as in the ones we've known for decades now. Now, I'm sure you realize I could go on and on about what is currently being done or is already being done, probably virtually until tomorrow, done by universities across the world to tackle climate change, but of course I'm not going to. Perhaps some of or all of what I've said reflects what your own institution is already doing or planning to engage in, or not at all. This is something that I would love to hear about from you when I'm done with this presentation. But for now, I'm going to move to the I guess, thornier subject of what challenges and barriers can stand in the way of universities that want to tackle climate action. And this part two, of course, is going to be far from exhaustive. So part two, challenges or barriers for universities to take climate action. Here, I'm going to simply list a number of obstacles, of major obstacles, or most common, rather, obstacles that are faced by colleges and universities in taking action against climate change. The first faction, of course, to mention, even before I get to my list, is the extreme diversity of higher education systems and resources, most emphatically, of course, in terms of funding, in which universities operate around the world, from systems that are vastly private, where top universities enjoy the largest endowments, level of resources, like in the US, to state-funded systems that are vastly subjected to governmental policies and control, and across many regions of the world suffer from chronic underfunding, okay? So of course, impossible to address such diversity here. Again, I can only limit myself to the most common broad obstacles and barriers that exist, of which I'll mention 5. First, the lack of okay, let me close this. Okay, the first obstacle is the lack of clear and consistent policies. No, this is not the right slide. I'm sorry. Where is, okay, I have to go back one more. Hang on a second. All right. Need to go back to regular mode. Okay, there was some of you who are regulars to this may have noticed I am not very good with slides. I tend to have problems with disappearing slides. In this particular case, there is one slide that disappeared. That would the slide that listed the most common areas where, or the most common barriers, problems that universities encounter when they seek to implement climate action. plans. Okay, sorry about that. I really don't know where it's gone. I can only assure you that it once existed. Okay, I'll say for my defense that you can be good at everything. I'm obviously not good with slides. Okay, 5 main, most commonly encountered obstacles and barriers. The first one is the lack of clear and consistent policies and incentives from governments and from regulators to low carbon transitions, to the implementation of a green economy, renewable energy based, grounded in renewable energy, etc. So this challenge, of course, is not specific to universities. It involves all institutional and non-institutional actors in any given society. Since not all states around the world are engaged in the transition to renewable energy at the same level, it of course makes sense that universities in systems that are vastly state dependent in particular, that don't have a large margin of autonomy, should encounter greater difficulty in launching climate action initiatives. It is those universities in particular that the UN Race to Zero campaign I mentioned earlier targets specifically. But you can see that with only about, as I said, 1,000 universities having joined the campaign so far, there's still a very, very long way to go. The second set of obstacles can be the complexity and the diversity of university operations, okay? That may require different approaches, different solutions for different campuses, for different faculties, for different departments. And this is, of course, an obstacle, a barrier, or a challenge that is at institutional level. And it speaks to the fact that even action that's limited to a single university, even with action at this level, the diversity and range of measures that must be undertaken to engage in the transition can be a very serious challenge for many institutions, in particular because the task for universities is double. One, engage in decarbonizing as organizations, in particular as organizations that are sometimes the size of a small town, okay? And 2, to promote education that raises climate change awareness among students, that encourages students to become climate change actors and even leaders as they transition to the labor market. Okay, so that's a double track that can make it very difficult for many institutions to engage in, because it certainly adds to the complexity of the endeavor. The number 3 common obstacle is, of course, the financial aid and logistical constraints of implementing large-scale changes. Large-scale changes for university can include retrofitting buildings, switching to renewable energy sources, divesting from fossil fuels, et cetera, And here again, the main factor is simply financial resources and the availability of expertise in accompanying the transition. And I think of this particular item, it can be said that this is really the area where there is the largest level of inequality among institutions, among colleges and universities across the world. The number 4 obstacle, often met obstacle, is the resistance or inertia on the part of stakeholders, whether we're talking about government as an actor or inside actors inside the university, meaning staff, sometimes students themselves, sometimes alumni, donors, partners, all of it because there may be a conflict of interest, or among stakeholders, there might be preferences that, policy preferences that do not prioritize climate action. In this respect, I have to point out that where climate change has become a political issue, an eminently political issue, and one that's become deeply polarized, as is the case, of course, in the United States. Engaging in climate action with all the means and the consultation between the various stakeholders that is required can be a daunting challenge, provided that there's even a will to do so at the level of the institution to begin with, okay? And finally, the last, fifth obstacle is the difficulty of measuring and reporting the impact and effectiveness of climate action initiatives, especially when they involve multiple actions and dimensions. This, I would say, is a major challenge in general, not just for universities, but for climate action at all levels, whether we're talking about government policy impact assessment or any set of policies or actions undertaken at any level, supranational, national, regional, community level that aim to tackle climate change. And this challenge is particularly crucial in light of the fact that it often takes years to measure, to assess the efficacy of any given course of action aimed at tackling climate change. Not to mention, of course, the time involved in correcting a course of action when inefficacies have been found, okay? So this is one of the great weaknesses, I would say, of climate change policies aimed at tackling climate change in general, on a very broad scale, not just at institutional level. Despite all of these challenges, of which I've mentioned only 5, it's worth pointing out that more and more universities around the world are finding ways to overcome circumstances and to demonstrate commitment, sometimes leadership, sometimes innovation in climate action. To conclude, go on to my final part, I just want to give you a small sample of recommendations. You have them in front of you, in fact, because the previous slide is missing, so you've had time to learn this one by heart while I was developing the previous point without a slide. In bullet point form, a small sample of recommendations that can be found. The reason I selected these is because they can be found in the higher education literature and media most commonly, okay? But there are, of course, many, many others. Regarding what more can be done by colleges and universities, but here, because of their specificity as institutions to tackle climate change, keeping in mind, of course, that many universities are already doing at least some of that, sometimes all of that, and sometimes more than that, okay? But these are the most common, let's say, recommended or suggested courses of action that you can find in the literature and in the media, okay? So you can see the build accredited teaching programs at all levels of study and research activities. So this talks to, of course, something I've mentioned earlier, which is the educational dimension of university operations, okay? So educating an entire generation to be climate aware and more. But here the idea is of putting in place an accreditation mechanism, okay? Needless to add that this is happening on an increasing scale around the world, but this is seen as one of the types of action that will develop further in the future and gain more and more acknowledgement in coming years. The second one is part of a governance strategic plan, and it can be to prioritize the development of advanced curricula on decarbonization solutions, okay, which has the advantage of addressing both tracks that I mentioned earlier. Own decarbonization as an institution, okay, campus decarbonization, and then decarbonization as a matter of policy and as a matter of advocacy. Develop awareness, developing or training events focused on staff where necessary on students, because we do assume that, as I mentioned earlier, this is a generation of acutely climate conscious students, but of course, this is culturally dependent and is not true to the same extent across the world. So wherever necessary, develop that kind of awareness through training programs, besides educational programs among students as well. But mostly this kind of initiative targets staff, okay? Whether administrative, faculty, all categories. The next one is to lead public initiatives at all levels, okay? But first and foremost, of course, at the local level, at community level, to communicate climate change mitigation measures, literature, contents, provided that, of course, the work is done to adapt this kind of contents to the wider community. Here again, universities are seen as having the ideal potential to play a leading role in reaching out to the broader community. The next one is work with states and private sectors, state sector, private sector, to build evidence-based policy and innovation centers. This is, of course, the science part, the scientific part. It is especially important today because of the, how shall we describe it, the kind of discredit might be a too strong a word, but there's certainly, we have certainly been witnessing growing suspiciousness among the broader public over the past decade or so, a little more regarding science, regarding expertise, okay? So this is viewed as a course of action that is going to enable universities and that universities should embark upon in order to sort of restore the credibility of science, of evidence-based policy. And the last one, which is perhaps the most astute recommendation, is that wherever you find barriers to implementation that are financial, okay, the difficulty of financing, of resourcing initiatives, or alternatively, or perhaps in a combined manner, too complex institutional structure and management, you find this recommendation now increasingly across the literature, which is to partner up with industry. Partner up with industry, as all of you are familiar with the partnerships that have been partnership programs that have been developing over the past decade, 2 decades between universities and industries regarding the development of skills, the promotion of skills, transferable skills, skills that are immediately transferable to the labor market, etc. Based on the same model here, develop partnership with businesses, with industry, which of course would provide universities that need it with a source of funding to develop action policies that are aimed at combating climate change. Okay, so I'll leave it at that today. Needless to say, this is only a very tiny, very limited sample of what could be said on the subject. There's really huge, absolutely huge. There's an ocean, or more than that. Talking about climate change is a happy choice of a word, of resources, of research that is being done, of academic, scientific publications, and it's a growing subject that the media, higher education media, is devoting more and more attention to, and I can see that since the most of my job is to keep track of these things. Okay, so again, I'm going to nevertheless leave it at that. Just as a final note, I want to point out that I believe that the climate change issue is going to have a profoundly transformative impact on universities in years to come, not less than the challenges posed by artificial intelligence that I've talked about in the past, though of course in ways entirely different, but the impact will be enormous. And I think, given that that's a fact, it would be wise for, I think, all institutions at any level, regardless of their level of ability, resources available, et cetera, it would be worth paying attention. It would be worth reflecting on ways to join the action, all the way down to rethinking things that we, perhaps less evidently think about, that are less tangible climate change challenges, and that I haven't addressed at all here. For example, what will happen to international student mobility? As in, flying back and forth between home and sometimes universities that are halfway across the world, as one of the way in which higher education can add value, become a more attractive proposition, not to mention the funding resource that international students represent for countless institutions across the world. This is, of course, based on a residential, not online model. What will happen to that as air travel becomes more and more controversial? What will happen to academic conferences with faculty, faculty having enjoyed for decades and decades taking part in academic conferences around the world, the crucial role that academic conferences play in advancing scientific knowledge, creating networks, et cetera, that cannot be replaced by the online substitute, as I'm sure all of you would agree, but that again required, flying regularly to faraway destinations, et cetera. Okay, so many challenges, many changes in the making, some of which are going to affect absolutely everybody, most of which I would say are going to affect absolutely everybody who works in higher education in any capacity. Okay, so I will leave it at that. Thank you for your patience, for sticking it out this far.